The NFL season is at the mid-year mark, and suffice it to say, the Giants campaign has not gone the way anyone has hoped. We look at some of the twists and turns of a lost season and how the team can recover moving forward, as we're joined by special guest Ed Valentine of Big Blue View. That's coming your way next on the Locked On Giants podcast.
You are Locked On Giants, your daily New York Giants podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This episode of the Locked On Giants podcast is brought to you by GameTime. Download the GameTime app, create an account, and use the promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Last-minute tickets, lowest prices guaranteed. Hello, New York Giant fans. Welcome to another edition of the Locked On Giants podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast family, your team every day. My name is Patricia Traina. I'm your host, and I'm joined today by Ed Valentine of Big Blue View. And they say, Edward, that misery enjoys company. And my gosh, what a miserable New York Giants season we're having. So I can't think of a better person to discuss it with than you, because we've been friends for like forever. And this is time for some group therapies that maybe between the two of us, we have some group therapy and we extend it to my listeners. But what a season. My goodness.
There you go, Patty. And you caught me taking one last sip of coffee there, trying to get fired up, trying to get ready to bring my A game today. You know, Patty, this is all too familiar, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It is. I feel like last year we were all encouraged. We were like, whoa, what is this? We thought better days were ahead. And this year, so many things have gone wrong. I mean, the injuries you can certainly point to, but that's really nothing new with this team, it seems. But Ed, let's take a look at some of the decisions that have kind of set this team up for where they're at right now. You and I have discussed it before, but we'll discuss it for our listeners here in terms of head scratchers that, maybe go back to the spring, whether, it be roster, how the roster was built, how the coaches approach this game. We'll talk about Daniel Jones. So Ed, let's start at the beginning with some of the head scratchers that you see as being the most relevant in terms of this team's downfall.
Boy, Patty, there have been so many of those. I've written about those. I've tweeted about some of those. I've done podcasts about some of those. And I have to admit, there's been so many, running all the way up to, I'm not sure I've understood yet an offensive line group that the Giants have run out there on any single week, but it's almost hard to remember when you go all the way back to the spring. But you can look at how the Giants constructed the 90-man roster. You can look at the fact that there were roughly 87 slot receivers on the 90-man roster.
90.
And Richie James, who was their leading wide receiver last year, wasn't one of them. Not that Richie James being on the roster or not is going to make any difference in the Giants being 2-7. But, there were 1 million slot receivers. There were positions, and I always say you can't address every position every offseason. But, there were more slot receivers than they were ever going to be able to keep. They didn't address some defensive depth positions in terms of, the edge, in terms of offensive line depth, in terms of even, I know they added Darren Waller, but you've basically entered a season where you've used 2 tight ends all season long. It's been head scratching, from the very beginning. If you have a couple of specific offseason decisions that you want to talk about, throw them out there, and I'd be happy to do that.
Yeah, I know one decision that, you mentioned Darren Waller, who was coming off of a season, ending injury the year before, who was always a kind of a risk. And if you remember, when he showed up on week 1's injury report, we were told by head coach Brian Daboll, oh, our plan all along was to give him a rest day, because he was coming back from injury. But yet he didn't have any kind of, rest during the preseason, as I recall. And that rest day, by the way, went away once he got healthy. So, stuff like that was a head scratcher. The lack of depth really at punt returner, which has been a big time problem. They had oh gosh, Eric
Jamison
Gray,
Crowd, and they
and they had
had
Jamison Crowder who could have done it and
right.
who was accomplished. So I just feel like they've pushed a lot of square pegs into round holes. I was screaming about an edge rusher because Azeez
Mhm.
Ojulari's injury history kind of pointed to a good chance of him getting injured again. You can maybe make a case for depth at defensive line. They had problems with Ashawn Robinson coming off of the injury. Now he's been playing well. Raheem Nunez-Roches had some issues there. So I mean, up and down, you can point to different issues that this team has had, and I don't understand some of the decisions that they made, including the fact that they had 90 slot receivers.
Yeah, you're right about the punt returner situation was interesting, and we saw that all through training camp. They shoved a square peg into a round hole with Eric Gray. When they had Jamison Crowder, they had Jaden Mickens in training camp, who's an experienced return guy. They kind of did that in a lot of cases this year, Patty. Look at, one of my big issues this year has been now injuries are injuries. All right. There's nothing that could be done. If you don't get a field goal blocked in week 1, maybe Andrew Thomas doesn't miss any games. All right. But, he suffers a hamstring injury in that situation. But, my problem when I look at the whole thing is you've made it clear. They made it clear from week 2 forward that they did not trust Matt Peart to be their swing tackle. So why was Matt Peart on the roster? Why did you spend money on Bobby McCain, a safety who you're not using, when you could maybe have used that money to sign a veteran swing tackle if you didn't trust Matt Peart? Because you shoved a square peg into a round hole with Josh Azudu playing left tackle. You shoved another square peg into a round hole with Justin Pugh playing left tackle. And for all of Brian Daboll's talk during training camp, during the summer, about how moving guys around and going to the extreme of changing the lineup every 2 snaps during training camp practices, changing the offensive line alignment, they ended up in week 2 using a bunch of guys at a bunch of positions they weren't prepared to play. They ended up using Josh Azudu at left tackle, where he didn't practice all summer and hadn't practiced since last season. They ended up using Marcus McKethan as the starting right guard after he missed all of last year, including preseason, and played 20 snaps this year in training camp. And he clearly showed that he may be talented, but he's not ready. So they just left themselves in a position where they weren't prepared for a lot of the things that happened.
Yeah. And, you mentioned injuries. I want to touch upon that just real quick. You mentioned the Andrew Thomas injury. Well, if you knew Andrew Thomas pulled a hamstring on that blocked field goal, why was he allowed to play the entire game or most of the entire game, where he obviously made that injury worse? We look more recently, Daniel Jones coming back from a neck injury. Why was he the guy who was trying to do the tush push when
That
he
was
had the neck?
stupid, Patty. That
I don't
was
get that.
stupid.
I mean, that's another thing, you look at, and again, sticking with Daniel Jones, he hurt his knee on that one play. And, on the sideline, they're asking him, oh, are you okay? Well, what the heck did they expect him to say? No, I'm not. I mean, they don't know this guy by now. So just that hasn't helped. People look at the injuries, some of the decisions they have made with these players that have been banged up. Darren Waller, he mentioned that he hurt himself in the Washington game. And, what exactly were they doing there? So they,
Yeah.
the injuries are going to happen. I get it. But some of the decisions made with the guys who were injured, I just don't understand.
Right. And specifically in regard to Waller, all right. Waller is still the Giants' leading receiver. I fully understood the reason for the Giants trading for Darren Waller. They only gave up a third round pick that was 100th overall. That wasn't originally their pick anyway. They basically turned Kadarius Toney into Darren Waller. And that's a plus. That's an upgrade.
Yeah.
But there was always risk, and we're seeing the risk. And it's interesting. You kind of mentioned it, Patty. One of the things that drove me a little nuts in the summer and even in the spring was the NBA style load management stuff that was going on in training camp and throughout the spring. And curiously, if you think back on August on those practices, Patty, one guy who really wasn't being load managed was Darren Waller. He was out there almost every single day, very rarely getting a day off, very rarely getting back down. And yet we find out once the season comes that he has long-term, I think he said he has long-term nerve damage in that original hamstring injury that he has to manage. And now he's dealing with a hamstring injury on the other side. And I don't know that one leads to the other, but it's a curious decision because you look at a guy with an injury history, and it felt like they were pushing a player with an injury history while they were backing off on some other guys. And I don't know about you, Patty, but we've talked. There's just almost everything Joe Shane and Brian Daboll did a year ago turned out right, and the things that didn't turn out right kind of got buried because the Giants had an unexpectedly successful season. For whatever reason, almost every decision that they've made this year, even the ones that I thought were right, like giving Daniel Jones a contract, even the ones that I thought were right, have all gone horribly wrong.
Yeah. Well, we'll talk about the Daniel Jones contract after the break because that's a big one that I know a lot of people are asking about. So don't go anywhere, folks. We'll be right back. Hey, Giant fans, if you want to secure tickets to your favorite concert shows and sporting events without the stress, you need to check out GameTime, the fast and easy way to buy tickets right up until the day of the event. With amazing deals on last-minute tickets and their best prices guaranteed, you can stop stressing over the tickets and start getting hyped for the fun that you're going to have. With GameTime, you not only get the lowest prices, you also get clear images of your seats and event cancellation protection. And if you find tickets in the same section and row for less, GameTime will credit you 110% of the difference. So go ahead and snag the tickets without the stress with GameTime. Download the GameTime app, create an account, and use the promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Last minute tickets, lowest prices guaranteed. Terms apply. Again, that promo code is LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase at GameTime. All right, everybody, welcome back to the Locked On Giants podcast. You got me, Patricia Turner, your host, joined by Ed Valentine, Big Blue View. And Ed, let's talk about this Daniel Jones decision because back in the spring, it was pretty obvious that the Giants prioritized getting Daniel Jones's contract done because they did not want to have to pay him the franchise tag amount, which I think was $33 million for a quarterback. They felt that that might hamper what they were going to do in free agency. So they instead worked diligently to get him done. They tried to get Saquon Barkley done. That did not happen. And the thinking there, I believe, was that, okay, if we don't get him done, he's only going to cost us $10 million to franchise tag. Meanwhile, the Giants go and they sign Daniel Jones to a 4-year, $160 million deal that has an escape hatch after 2 years, which kind of signified that they were not completely sold on Daniel Jones. At least that's how I interpreted it. So that being said, a lot of people are like, well, why did they even bother to sign him? Given where they were drafting, I think they had no choice. Plus, you look at the market at the time, people were saying, oh, Jimmy G, they were saying Marcus Mariota, and we all saw how they worked out for their respective teams. But let's go back to that Daniel Jones contract. Obviously another injury history to deal with. Now he's got the ACL, which is season ending. He had the neck injury, which according to the Athletic, there was a report that he was still not pain free as of last week. So now where do they go from here with Daniel Jones? I mean, the way I see it, I think they're stuck with him next year.
Oh, I think they are too, Patty. Now, you're going all the way back to the end of last season. Joe Schoen made it 100% clear right from the beginning that quarterback was going to be the priority over running back. I mean, he basically said, we have one franchise tag and Daniel Jones is going to be our quarterback. And if somebody, as in Saquon Barkley, which he didn't say out loud, but he said, if somebody has to leave, somebody has to leave. He made it crystal clear that they would prioritize Daniel Jones. And I'll be honest, I'll be upfront. I've said this all along. I always thought that was the right priority because quarterback is more important to a franchise than running back. You can win without the superstar running back if you do other things well, if you block well. You're not getting to the promised land without a top-tier quarterback. And I agree with you, Patty. After last season, when you look at the draft spot the Giants were in, when you look at the players who were available, what were the Giants supposed to do? If you just say, bye-bye, Daniel Jones, we're going with Tyrod Taylor, I think there's another factor in there. You're basically telling the entire locker room full of players who just won a playoff game that everything they did last year doesn't mean a thing. You're basically risking losing the entire locker room because I think that whatever you think of Daniel Jones, he's beloved in that room. He's looked at as the leader in that room, and he's a guy that players really like. There's no question in their minds, that he's their guy. So I think they had no choice. Where they go from here, I don't know about you. I don't really think what they do the next 9 games makes any difference.
Yeah.
Tommy DeVito's a nice story, but okay. Tommy DeVito's a nice story. Matt Barkley might be this year's Mike Glennon. Who knows? But really what matters to me is whether or not the Giants decide to go and draft a quarterback early in the 2024 draft. And you've written it. I've written it. Whether Jones is back next year or not, and he has to be on the roster next year because he's a $47 million cap hit. You can't dump him. There's no way. Even if he turns into next year's Tyrod Taylor, where he's the backup for whoever they draft, if they draft a quarterback in round 1, you can't just dump Jones and move on. But I think you're in that situation where it's 5 years. Next year would be 6 because yes, I can do math, but whatever the reason, and Daniel Jones has shortcomings, Patty. We know that. He's not a perfect quarterback. He's not Patrick Mahomes or Aaron Rodgers or Tom Brady or whoever. But whatever the reasons, it simply hasn't worked with Daniel Jones. It hasn't happened the way you need it to happen, whether some of that's Jones, whether that's the coaching mess that the Giants have been during his time, whether it's the injuries, whatever it is, it's 5 years now and it hasn't worked. The Giants are going to be in position with a quarterback class that's supposedly rich in quality guys. They're in position to find a guy to move forward with after Jones. And I think they have to.
Yeah. And I made this point in an article I wrote yesterday. Forget about the prior years with Jones. This is year 2 in the same system. I don't think anybody's going to look back at the body of work, and weigh that heavily, although it factors in. Year 2 in the same system. And I don't know about you, Ed, but on Sunday, I thought Jones looked like he was playing in this system for the first time. He was holding on to the ball too long. He was indecisive. He airmailed a few passes that, the two to Jalen Hyatt, that if that ball had been on target, maybe that would have been 7 per reception. He looked like he regressed. And I don't want to hear, Russ, because he's been in the system. He allegedly knows the system. And the same issues keep coming up. The slow processing time, which, by the way, is not a good thing when you have an offensive line that's maybe shaky with its pass protection. All right. You can't have that. And at this point, if you're the coaching staff, if you're Joe Shane, you got to say, all right, you know what? Maybe we look to move on. We get a young guy in here who can process a little faster. Let Brian Daboll and if it's Mike Kofka or whoever's the offensive coordinator next year, let them develop this guy. We have him on a rookie contract, and you're going to have a situation kind of similar to what they had in 2019 when Eli Manning got benched and he was carrying a $19 million base salary, and he was the most expensive backup quarterback in the league at the time. That's where I think this is headed with Daniel Jones. Would you agree?
Oh, I would definitely agree with that, Patty. It almost has to. And as I've said, you're right. It's 2 years in the new system, and Daniel Jones looked awful on Sunday. And I wondered, he airmailed the first throw of the game. He threw 2 passes off target to Jalen Hyatt. He threw a ball to Darius Slayton that should have been intercepted. And I wondered if, as much as Daniel Jones wanted to be out there, I wondered if he knew he wasn't 100%. I wondered if he's still feeling some pain in that neck and he was uncertain, on top of the fact that he's sometimes uncertain anyway, and I wondered how healthy he was to begin with, being out there. I just wondered, because he never looked comfortable from the very first snap. He never looked comfortable. He never looked confident. But the reality of it is, the reasons for why it doesn't work or hasn't worked with Daniel Jones don't matter anymore. It's been 5 years and it hasn't worked. You can't keep going down this road. It's time, as much as I like Daniel and all of that, it's time to start looking toward the future and looking toward another direction.
Right. You put a rookie contract or a quarterback on a rookie deal, and you build the team up the way it was supposed to be built, not this haphazard way that they granted they were kind of forced to go in that direction because of the success from last year that kind of toppled the domino, so to speak.
Right. I think it changed a lot of the plan, Patty.
Sure.
The reality of it is, I asked Joe Shane way back when the Jones contract was signed. I remember asking him if he had ever thought when he took this job that he would have been in this situation. Because you know how this goes. New coach, new GM come in, they have an existing quarterback, they have some existing players, contracts being what they are, they give those guys a year, and then they get shoved out the door and they draft their guy.
Right.
That didn't happen with Jones and Joe Shane. I asked him, and he was very clear that, no, I didn't think I'd be in this spot. I didn't think I'd be giving Daniel Jones a big contract. He said, if I'd have thought this was going to work out this way, I would have used the 5th-year option.
Yeah.
He was very clear about that.
Yep.
And he is sometimes very honest. And so he was very clear that he's surprised to be here with Daniel Jones. And what's going to happen, they draft a quarterback. All they really are is a year behind where they thought they would be in terms of turning this offense over and finding their own guy.
Right. Right. All right. Now, Ed, coming up, I want to talk about the coaching because I think that's something we need to address. So we got one more commercial break. We'll be right back after this. Hey, Giant fans. So between my work here on the Locked On Giants podcast on Giants Country and being on site to bring you all the latest Giants coverage, some days I just don't have time to get to the grocery store to make sure that my fridge is full. Luckily, I don't have to, thanks to DoorDash. With DoorDash, I get everything I want when I need it delivered straight to my door. For years, I've trusted DoorDash to also deliver freshly made meals from my favorite restaurants, and they've never let me down. And now that they've added grocery delivery to their offering, it's made my life so much easier. DoorDash has thousands of grocery stores to choose from, so you're sure to find one in your neighborhood that's right for you, like Wegmans, BJ's Wholesales, and more. You'll get what you ordered, or they will make it right. And you can save on all your grocery and restaurant favorites with a no delivery fee on eligible orders with a Dash Pass membership. And now for a limited time, you can get 50% off your first DoorDash order up to $20 when you use the promo code LOCKEDONNFL at checkout. That's 50% off up to $20, no minimum subtotal, and zero delivery fees on your first order when you download the DoorDash app and enter the promo code LOCKEDONNFL. Terms apply. All right, everybody, welcome back to Locked On Giants. I'm Patricia Traina, joined by good friend Ed Valentine, Big Blue View. And look, the season's over. I mean, there's still 8 games left, but the season's over. 2-7. The Giants aren't going anywhere. Ed, I think we need to talk about the coaching. Last year, the coaching, we were praising it. We were praising, how good Mike Kofka looked as a first-year offensive coordinator. We were singing Wink Martindale's praises. The league obviously took notice. Both of them got head coaching interviews, multiple head coaching interviews, I believe. This year, Wink Martindale not doing too bad of a job, all things considered. The defense got off to a slow start, but he's kind of made it work. Can't be the same can't be said for Mike Kofka. There's been obviously some speculation that Brian Daboll has gotten a little bit more involved with the offensive coaching. Ed, am I the only person who thinks that Kofka will not be back next year?
No, there's at least 2 of us on this podcast. My best guess with Mike Kofka, the best thing Mike Kofka could do,
College job.
Absolutely. He should be networking behind the scenes to find himself a college job, because Patty, I don't have any inside information on this, but I know one thing. I know darn well that with Brian Daboll's background, if they draft a quarterback in the first or second round, it's going to be Brian Daboll who babysits that quarterback and who oversees that quarterback and who calls plays for that quarterback and who is hands-on in the development of that quarterback. It's not going to be Mike Kofka. Mike's either going to get knocked down a peg to an offensive coordinator who doesn't call plays, or he's going to get fired. And so, yeah, if I was Mike Kofka, I would be looking for a college job at this point, because the way this season has gone, nobody's going to be interviewing him for head coaching jobs this year. Not when you have a league worst offense averaging, a ridiculous 11 point something points per game. So yeah, so Mike needs to be looking for other avenues. But the coaching, Patty, from a lot of aspects has been mystifying. Decisions by the coaches have been mystifying. And you're right. Last year, I did it, you did it, we all did it. We all looked at this coaching staff that Brian Daboll hired and said, wow, what a fantastic job he did going out and not just hiring his cronies, going out and hiring successful veteran NFL coordinators, position coaches, guys he didn't know, guys he was willing to work with despite the fact he had no previous relationship. And this year, Patty, I got to be honest, the head scratching stuff started way back in OTAs for me, because Daboll was screaming bloody murder in OTAs that his assistant coaches couldn't get the right players in position to run drills. I was like, what is going on here? This is a veteran coaching staff. These are guys who have done this and know this and been together now for a second season. Why can't you get the right players lined up on the field, in a walkthrough OTA drill? And it really hasn't stopped. There have been questionable decisions by Daboll himself in a lot of cases all year long. Exposing Daniel Jones the other day to a tush push when he's not 100% healthy is just one of them. You know, I would argue 2 weeks ago about not going for it on 4th and 1 against the Jets. We talked about that a lot with a kicker that they knew was compromised, and that's the handling of the Graham Gano situation's another really, really curious one. For me, Patty, there have been questionable offensive game plans every single time Daniel Jones has been on the field. The first 2 weeks, I thought they basically ignored Saquon Barkley. For 3 weeks after Barkley was hurt, you know, you're searching for offense, but I still thought they could have tried to run the ball more. They finally decided to ride Barkley really heavily, you know, once he came back and Tyrod Taylor was in the lineup. And what happened on Sunday, Patty? What happened on Sunday? The first 2 drives, Saquon Barkley, I don't think, touched the football. It was drop back and throw, drop back and throw, drop back and throw every single play. And I was like, what are you doing here? How about you hand the ball off a couple times, ride Barkley, who when he did get the ball was finding huge holes to run in, and let your quarterback, who hasn't played in a month, let him settle into the game a little bit. You know, even though, yeah, he's highly paid and all that, but let him settle into the game. Don't just make it obvious from the first play of the game that you're going to throw the ball 40 times and try to ride the guy. So I've questioned in-game decisions. I've questioned game plans. I've questioned a lot of what I've seen throughout practices all year. So, you know, I'm shaking my head like everybody else.
Let me ask you this, Ed, because I know you and I share the same opinion about this, but Brian Daboll right now is a CEO type of head coach. If Kofka does leave or is not back next year and Daboll takes over the play calling and becomes the main offensive coordinator, I'm sure he would promote somebody to that role, offensive coordinator, but Daboll would be the guy. Normally, I would probably be like, yeah, I'm not crazy about this. But considering that Wink Martindale, who I don't think is going anywhere, is an experienced defensive coordinator who knows what he's doing and who's perfectly capable of running that defense by himself. I don't know what happens with T-Mac on special teams. That's another one that's up in the air. But would you feel comfortable with Daboll calling the plays, given the makeup of the coaching staff, depending, of course, on what happens with McGahee?
Absolutely, Patty. I think I, like you, am a fan of the CEO style head coach. I loved, Tom Coughlin was perfectly capable of running the offense if he had chosen to run the offense, but he didn't do that. He allowed Kevin Gilbride to run the offense for years. He allowed Ben McAdoo to call the plays. And we know that behind the scenes and, drive to drive, Coughlin had his impact. It was we're going heavy personnel here and, whatever personnel package or whatever. Coughlin's imprint was all over both sides of the ball. But in this case, I agreed with Joe Shane when he hired Brian Daboll that Joe was clear that he wanted a CEO style head coach. And I think that was right for Brian Daboll for the simple reason that it allowed Brian Daboll to do something really important. It allowed Brian Daboll to get to know his entire roster. It allowed Brian Daboll to build relationships across the entire team, defense, special teams guys. It allowed him to build relationships throughout the building, throughout the organization. And he's had 2 years to do that now. And from my perspective, he's done a really good job of that. And, it was one of the things he was lauded for a year ago. But as I said earlier, if they're going to draft a young quarterback, if they're going to get this offense turned around, it's Brian Daboll's neck that's on the line, and it's running an offense and calling plays is something he's good at, something he's always done well. So at this point with Wink Martindale, running the defense. I have no problem with Daboll taking that over in 2024 if he chooses to do so.
Wouldn't be surprising if that's the direction they go. It makes the
Not at
most
all.
sense, especially as you said, if they draft a young quarterback to develop, which it looks like is a very, very strong possibility, especially as these losses continue to pile up. And if they have a top 10 pick, which don't forget, they have an extra second round pick that if they need to package to move up, they will be able to maybe do so with a team that maybe doesn't need a quarterback, but, might want another, attractive player at a different position. So a lot of turnover coming in the off season. We still have 8 more games, God help us all, to get through. You know what, Ed, like I said, this has been therapeutic. Group hug for everybody because
Big old group hug, Patty. Big old group hug.
Everyone. That goes to all the listeners out there. It's been rough, guys. But anyway, that's going to do it for us here on the Locked On Giants podcast. Appreciate y'all tuning in, making us your first listen of the day, or if you watch on YouTube, your first watch of the day. And a shout out, by the way, to my Blue Crew, my everydayers, my newcomers, and everybody in between. Don't forget, keep it here all week long. We've got the crossover Thursday tomorrow with Marcus Mosher of Locked On Cowboys. That ought to be an interesting one. And then, of course, on Friday, we'll have another show for you. Check out Ed Valentine's work at Big Blue View. And, of course, check out my written work at Giants Country. So for Ed Valentine, I'm Patricia Traina. Thank you all for tuning in, and we'll see you tomorrow.